The views and opinions expressed in The Fact Is with Hollis Grant are those of Hollis Grant and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Droids Canada Network. Droids Canada Network does not take responsibility for any content or position produced by Hollis Grant and his show. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant, and today we're looking at corruption. And we're looking at corruption on a large level in the country of Canada. Canada is known as a great place to live. In fact, it always ranks in either one or to the top 5 of the best countries to live in. Constantly sings its praises about how diverse the nation is and how superior the spirit of Canadians are, and how the politicians are so fantastic and give back and want to create this socialist utopia that is Canada. But when you start looking a little bit deeper, you realize that Canada is nothing but a wannabe Soviet Union, a sad country that is so ripe with fraud, political corruption, and corruption of its police forces. The Ontario Provincial Police, if you look at it as a state police for our American listeners, you'd have to think that there is some accountability and some high ethical standards that the police force would have. They answer to no one other than the politicians and serve the politicians' political will. In case in point, for one particular case, and there are several others, but November 2009, and what happened in November 2009 was the OPP was brought to court over police inaction. This all happened around the Grand River land dispute, and there was a particular individual, a Sam Galateri, who was beaten up while police stood by and watched and did not do anything. So, taken from a Wikipedia article here, the allegations. So, throughout the occupation and protests, and that's what was happening, it was a land dispute between the Indians and some developers. Many Caledonia residents complained that there had been subject to threats and violence from the Indian protesters, and that the Ontario Provincial Police failed to take any action to protect them. David Brown, who lived there with his wife near the disputed area at the time, testified in court November 2009 that he was required to carry a native-issued passport and needed approval from the Indian protesters to enter his own home. Now notice, this is not on the disputed land. This is off of the disputed land. He also claimed that after arriving, quote, after curfew one day, he was denied entry and jailed by the OPP when he caused trouble by ignoring the natives. So the Indian set up a makeshift barricade to restrict travel into an area that is not in the disputed lands of this land territory, and the OPP arrests the Canadian citizen. They arrest the Canadian citizen. Brown alleged native protesters threatened and harassed him repeatedly, and that rocks and mud were thrown at his family and their home. Brown and his wife sought $7 million in a civil lawsuit against the OPP on the basis that the police did nothing to protect him and his family during the occupation. In response to Brown's claims, Crown lawyer stated that the situation must be understood against the backdrop of a unique character of Indian occupations and protests, and that the OPP were prevented from taking action due to policy implications. He also suggested that Brown had fabricated portions of his testimony to draw attention to his lawsuit. And when he was asked why Brown kept a loaded shotgun, Brown responded that, "We are doing what we had to do to stay alive. I had no protection from our government. I felt I needed to protect my wife and family." In court testimony, OPP investigator Brian Hagleth stated that the Indian protesters set up a checkpoint, almost like they were entering another country, and that community lost confidence in the OPP's ability to protect them. Hagleth also testified that when natives set fire to a wooden bridge in town, the fire department withdrew from fighting the blaze when threatened by protesters. The chief of police told the OPP he did not believe they would protect him or his men. In addition, an electrical substation was destroyed, causing more than $1 million in damages and blackout, when the truck crashed through its gate and was left ablaze. Hagleth said that there was little response from the police. Investigator Hagleth also testified that he had asked for a change in policy at a subsequent meeting he had with OPP superiors, but that his request was denied. On June 15, 2009, some Caledonia residents announced the formation of an unarmed militia to enforce laws they felt the OPP had failed to uphold. Six Nation Councillor Claudine Van Every Albert, along with OPP spokesperson Constable Paula Wright, both spoke out against the formation of a militia, and 3 days later, Ontario Community Safety Minister Rick Bartolucci called it a, quote, "dumb idea. It is a dumb idea for citizens to be defending themselves against a bunch of Indians that are trying to destroy their homes." On July 8, 2011, Ontario Attorney General Chris Bentley announced a settlement of $20 million ending a class action lawsuit, which had been filed by 440 residents, 400 businesses, and a handful of subcontractors, which claimed negligence and malfeasance on part of the provincial government and the OPP for failing to properly protect citizens who live near Douglas Creek Estates in the town of Caledonia. Some residents continued independent lawsuits. Now, the government is willing to pay $20 million just to end it because they knew they were in the wrong. But this isn't quite the end of the story. So on September 13, 2007, builder Sam Galatieri was attacked and seriously injured in a confrontation with Indian protesters at the 90-home Sterling South subdivision development in Caledonia, this new subdivision that was being built. Following a brief occupation 2 weeks prior, a small group of Indians had occupied the property that morning, and the confrontation was going to end peacefully in the afternoon before Sam arrived and clashed with the young protesters. So on December 2nd, 2011, Richard Smoke, a Indian Mohawk, was convicted of assault for the attack on Sam, who had asked Smoke and several others to leave his daughter's house, which he was helping build as a wedding present. Smoke apologized to Sam in court in one of several criminal cases arising out of the occupation. This was the particular situation. This particular assault happened while OPP watched. They were there and they watched the assault occur and they did nothing. Now, why would the OPP do absolutely nothing? Well, the reason why the OPP did absolutely nothing, because that directive came down from then current Premier Dalton McGuinty, that was watching the situation closely and had instructed the OPP to not do anything. So here you have a politician that was also involved in later scandals, including $1 billion missing in some gas plants, some wind turbine issues, cover-ups. All that aside, telling and instructing the police not to do anything based on political points, as he didn't want to upset or offend or stop the Indians from protesting, because the last thing that he would want to do is lose his seat of power. That government managed to rule Ontario for 15 years. Fast forward to the power plant scandal in 2014, when the OPP knock on Dalton McGuinty's door and start questioning him about the gas plant. Now, what happened in a scandal, a cover-up? What happened was there was a deal to build a gas plant. It was going to cost $1 billion, and that was in a key riding for the Liberals in Mississauga. What happened is they guaranteed it, and then all of a sudden, a couple months later, they said, "No, we're just going to tear up this contract, and don't worry, we're not going to build this power plant." But what happened was everyone was still paid for not doing any of the work, and no planning had gone into it. So everyone walked away with $1 billion worth of taxpayer dollars, and these developers and Liberals had a lot of money. Now, when they went to knock on the door and question Dalton McGuinty, the Premier of Ontario, they left, and then Dalton McGuinty, and his aide, now his aide went to jail for this, deleted hard drives off of all the computers, and only the aide was arrested for this crime and served only a mere couple of months. Dalton McGuinty, still to this day, has not seen any jail nor has talked further about the gas plant scandal. Now, moving on to the federal level, we'll get into the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Now, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would be the equivalent of the FBI, a federal police force. Now, unlike the FBI, the Canadian Mounted Police are more treated like an army, and they're given a little bit different powers than the FBI, and not just a police force. Now, the great thing about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is they answer to the Prime Minister of Canada. So the SNC-Lavalin is a Quebec company that receives billions of dollars from taxpayers to keep itself afloat, and they design all sorts of crap to use. Now, this particular case is so fascinating. This is why Canada is no better than the former Soviet Union. Canada is no better than Botswana. So the SNC-Lavalin's board of directors became aware of financial irregularities concerning the company's activities in Libya by early 2009. The board raised concerns about the cost of a trip that al-Saidi Gaddafi took to Canada in 2008. Now, al-Saidi Gaddafi is the son of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, that trip in 2008 cost $1.9 million, which SNC-Lavalin paid for, which really was Canadian taxpayers. The board issued Stéphane Roy, the company's financial controller, a, quote, serious warning for the size of Gaddafi bill. The board also expressed concern about the amounts of cash kept by SNC's Libyan office. At that time, approximately $10 million. According to the company's chief financial officer, in May 2009, the board ordered that no more than $1 million in cash should be kept in the company's safe in Libya. On February 19, 2015, the RCMP and the Public Prosecution Service of Canada laid charges against SNC-Lavalin Group and its two subsidiaries, SNC-Lavalin International and SNC-Lavalin Construction. Each firm was charged with one count of fraud under Section 380 of the Criminal Code and one count of corruption under Section 3(1)B of the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act. The charge alleged that between 2001 and 2011, SNC-Lavalin paid $48 million Canadian in bribes to Libyan officials in the government of Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi also funded terrorism, was one of the largest exporter of Islamic jihadi terrorism. They also allege that at that time, the company defrauded the Libyan organizations of $130 million. On the same day, SNC-Lavalin announced that they were contesting the charges and planned to enter a non-guilty plea. In Canada, bidders for contracts with the Public Service Procurement Canada must conform to the integrity regime legislation passed in July 2015. The integrity regime is designed to exclude suppliers that have ethics-related criminal convictions such as bribery, price fixing, or lobbying offenses. If convicted, SNC-Lavalin could be banned from bidding on federal government contracts for up to 10 years. Following the 2015 Canadian federal election, with a Liberal government led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau coming into power, SNC-Lavalin lobbied the government to change the criminal code so that they could avoid criminal prosecution. The effort lasted 20 months and involved 51 meetings with government officials and MPs, or members of parliament, as well as officials in the opposition party leader's office and the newly elected coalition Quebec government. The targets of SNC-Lavalin's lobbying included the Minister of Public Services and Procurement and Accessibility, that's Carla Qualtrough, as well as officials in the Prime Minister's office. The company advocated for the rapid adoption of legislation to allow a new type of sentencing agreement called Deferred Prosecution Agreement, DPA. The changes to Ottawa's integrity regime to amend the 10-year contract ineligibility for suppliers with ethics-based criminal convictions. On recommendation from the Director of Public Prosecutions, Kathleen Roussel, former SNC-Lavalin Executive Vice President Norman Morin was charged in the Court of Quebec in May 2018 with making illegal donations to Canadian federal political parties. The charges, which were unrelated to the federal charges against the company, alleging that from 2004 and 2011, Morin orchestrated and solicited political donations from employees or their spouses to the Canadian federal political parties anonymously on behalf of SNC-Lavalin to be reimbursed afterwards. The amounts included about $110,000 to the Liberal Party and about $8,000 to the Conservative Party. In November 2018, Morin pled guilty to 2 of 5 charges and was fined a meager $2,000. The remaining 3 charges were dropped by the prosecution, so dropped by the government. The same government that was taking money to get elected and then paying it back once they were elected and now held power, receiving wonderful wage subsidies from the Canadian taxpayers. But they did drop the rest of the charges. Later in 2018, SNC-Lavalin brought a case to the federal court to compel the public prosecution services to offer in a DPA. In a decision issued on March 8, 2019, the court analyzed the DPA legislation and affirmed that the decision not to offer a DPA is within the discretion of the prosecutor. As part of the ruling, the court reaffirmed the principle of prosecution independence, and SNC-Lavalin's application to compile a DPA was rejected as having no reasonable prospect of success. Now, part of that large bill going back to Muammar Gaddafi's son was a lot of cocaine and a lot of Canadian prostitutes. There was a ton of coke and there was a ton of prostitutes, all paid for by the Canadian taxpayers. Now, going into the actual trial and going into all of this information that they had, the government, the RCMP compiled, the Prime Minister's office then decided to pressure the minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, as she wanted to go ahead and start the court prosecution. Prime Minister's office said, no, we don't think that we're going to go ahead with this, and forced them to drop the case, essentially forced Jody Wilson-Raybould to quit her role, forced her out of government, and now nothing happened. Sure, there's a few discussions on Parliament of what can happen, but the RCMP wouldn't dare arrest anyone from the Prime Minister's office. There was no follow-up. There was no criminal charges laid. All under the direction of the Prime Minister and his Canadian KGB. Now finally, we're going to jump ahead to something completely different. A different industry altogether. We're going to be talking about the Canadian housing market. The Canadian housing market. Well, why would we be talking about the Canadian housing market? What's that have to do with fraud or government inaction? Taken from an article from Global News, dated September 1st, 2021, the CRA, the Canadian Revenue, is similar as the IRS in America. A study from 1996 found that migrants bought British Columbia luxury homes despite having low incomes. A study conducted by the Canada Revenue Agency in 1996 and finally released 25 years later found a majority of homes bought in Burnaby and Coquitlam were purchased by rich immigrants who were declaring minimal global incomes, possibly laying the foundations for Vancouver's current housing crisis. The documents were first obtained by South China Monitoring Post reporter Ian Young, who noted that long-term Canadians who were making luxury homes within the same price bracket as declaring incomes 16 times higher. Young said he was shocked by the number of purchasers who had incomes that would be typically in line with those of refugees. One of the biggest shocking things to me was the average incomes that were being declared by these millionaire migrants who were buying these multi-million-dollar homes. He had initially submitted an information and privacy request for the study in 2016 on behalf of his news outlet and only received the full documents in late August of 2021. This was a 5-year wait. It's something I'd never heard of, Young said. It's really quite phenomenal. The Canadian Tax Agency study showed that during a 2-month period in 1994, 33 out of 37 named buyers of Burnaby luxury homes worth more than $800,000 were recent immigrants, whose average declared household global income was only $16,430. Young said the income declared by the 4 named long-term residents within that same time frame was $263,701 for the same class of properties. There were actually more than 40 purchases made during that period, but the CRA was not able to locate the name of all purchasers. One of the biggest discrepancies in data showed one buyer purchasing a $2.8 million home, but only declaring a global income of $174 in 1994. Another buyer who bought a Burnaby home worth $1.18 million declared less than nothing, negative $3,997. For the Coquitlam homes listed in a CRA study, the average recent immigrant income was listed at $33,785 for homes worth more than $600,000. In one case, a buyer who purchased a Coquitlam home for $1.178 million declared a negative global income of $19,582. Young believes the same structures exist today, allowing wealthy immigrants to purchase property without accurately disclosing their global income. It's very hard for the CRA to find out what someone owes and earns in China. There isn't just the data flow. Sometimes that becomes impossible to trace. So it becomes hard, said Young. There was a crackdown in the mid-2010s, but I don't know how far it got. That's hard to say because they don't like talking about it. Housing analyst Steve Startsky believes there's still no level playing field decades later, saying most banks look at foreign home buyers' assets and not their global income. They just look at your high net worth. So if you're a high net worth individual with a 35% down payment and you can show a good chunk of assets, then it's easy to get mortgages. Whereas if you're a local high income earner, you're paying 50% plus in tax rates. So it's very difficult to earn a high income in Canada and then save enough money after tax income as a down payment, he said. It certainly puts local Canadians at a disadvantage if you are here locally and earning and paying income tax. So the banking sector is not working for Canadians. The politicians aren't working for Canadians, and the police aren't working for Canadians. Canada is morally bankrupt. Canada is at a place where its actions are that of a third world banana republic. So much so that Canada is now on the eyes or on the radar of the FBI. And an article in 2001 on August 9th, and this is on BIV.com, Vancouver Central to, quote, sophisticated global pump and dump scheme, FBI. There are people that are being picked up for stock manipulation that live in Canada. There are rampant gangs in Canada, yet police are inactive. The political will is not there. And the citizens continue to get poorer and poorer with the increasing housing bubble that will eventually burst in Canada. And when that does burst, it will be far worse than anything that America has seen. And we've sort of highlighted a bit of the excessive housing costs in the show in past episodes, and go back on droidscanada.com to take a look. But until then, and as we continue on in our journey, it is evident we will see more scandal from provincial, municipal, and even federal politicians, and inaction by all sorts of police forces throughout Canada. I'll leave you with one final headline from CPA Canada. CPA, the Charter Professional Accountants of Canada. The Bean Counters of Canada. CPA Canada. An article by Peter Sean Taylor from April 27, 2020. And the headline is, Corruption and Financial Crime Have Tarnished Canada's Reputation. From accountants calling out corruption and financial crime. And these are the people that look after the books. Something is going to happen in Canada, and when it does, I've said it before and I'll say it again, it will be a bigger disaster than anything that happened in the United States. Until then, I'd like to thank you for listening to another edition of The Fact Is, and I'm your host, Hollis Grant. You have yourself a great week.
Dan, what happens every Thursday?
That would be DCR Droids Canada Radio.
And what time is it on Thursday?
That's from 9 till 11 p.m.
Dumb question, where do you find it?
You find that at accessradio.ca.
And what's the best part?
It's free.